Some of them changed their names, some fled to other continents, some spent their entire lives trying to make sense of what their fathers had done, and some never escaped the shadow at all. The children of the most powerful men in the Third Reich didn't disappear when Germany fell. They went somewhere. They became someone. And what happened to them is one of the most complex, haunting, and deeply human stories to come out of the Second World War. Of all the children left behind by the inner circle of the Nazi regime, few lived a life as dramatically reversed as Martin Bormann Jr. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., was one of Adolf Hitler's most powerful and trusted lieutenants. The head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, a man so close to Hitler that he controlled access to the Führer himself. He signed the orders. He managed the machinery. He was, by most accounts, among the most influential figures of the entire regime. Martin Bormann Jr. was born in 1930, the eldest of 10 children. He was raised in a household saturated with National Socialist ideology. He attended Nazi youth programs. He was, in every outward sense, shaped to become a product of that world. In 1945, when the Reich collapsed, he was 15 years old. He ended up in a camp for displaced persons, cut off from his family, uncertain whether his father was even alive. In the chaos of post-war Europe, the younger Bormann wandered through the wreckage of a country trying to rebuild itself. He eventually came under the care of Catholic clergy, and what happened next is something few would have predicted. He converted to Catholicism, then he trained for the priesthood. By 1958, Martin Bormann Jr. was an ordained Catholic priest. He spent years as a missionary in Africa and worked with impoverished communities far from Germany and far from the name he carried. He later became a teacher of religious studies, and unlike many children of high-ranking Nazis, he did not hide from his past. He confronted it directly and publicly. He described the process of reconciling his upbringing with the atrocities his father had been responsible for as one of the defining struggles of his life. He wrote about it. He spoke about it. He dedicated himself, in no small part, to understanding how a person could become what his father had become. Martin Bormann Sr. was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death. In 1972, construction workers near the Lehrter station in West Berlin uncovered human remains that were identified through dental records as his. Those remains were confirmed conclusively in 1998 through DNA testing. He had most likely died in Berlin in May 1945, during the chaotic final days of the war. His son outlived him by decades. A priest, a teacher, a man who spent his life standing in direct opposition to everything his father represented. Martin Bormann Jr. passed away in 2013 at the age of 82. His story is remarkable, but it is far from the most disturbing case among the children left behind. Coming up, the daughter of the man who orchestrated the Holocaust, and what she chose to do with her father's legacy. If Martin Bormann Jr. represents one end of the spectrum, Gudrun Himmler sits firmly at the other. Her father was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, architect of the concentration camp system, and one of the primary figures responsible for the mass extermination of millions of people across Europe. He was, by any measure, among the most dangerous men of the 20th century. Gudrun was born in 1929, and by all accounts was deeply devoted to her father throughout her childhood. She accompanied him on visits, including at least one visit to a concentration camp in 1941, documented in her diary, where she described the day as interesting and wrote that she was pleased her father showed her around. She was 11 years old. When the war ended, she was taken into custody alongside her mother by Allied forces. She was held briefly, and like many family members of high-ranking Nazis, she was eventually released. Her father, who had fled in disguise after Germany's surrender, was captured by British forces on May 20th, 1945. He died 3 days later while in custody. Gudrun was 16. And unlike Bormann's son, she appeared to spend very little of her subsequent life questioning her father's role in history. She became involved with an organization called Stille Hilfe, which translates roughly to silent help. The group was dedicated to supporting convicted war criminals, providing legal assistance, financial support, and help with appeals. Among those the organization reportedly assisted were some of the most notorious figures from the SS who had been convicted at Nuremberg and in subsequent trials. She was reportedly a central and long-standing figure within the organization, attending trials, maintaining contact with convicted individuals, and in at least one documented case, reportedly visiting an elderly former concentration camp guard who had been convicted of crimes against humanity. She avoided most media contact for much of her adult life and rarely gave interviews. German investigators and journalists who attempted to document Stille Hilfe's activities consistently found Gudrun's name appearing near the center of its operations. She married a man named Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, who was also connected to far-right political circles in Germany, and together they appeared to remain embedded in networks of former Nazis and their sympathizers for decades. She passed away in May 2018 at the age of 88, having never publicly renounced her father or his actions. The contrast between her life and Bormann's son could hardly be more stark, but both cases in their own way illustrate how the weight of being born into the Nazi inner circle played out across an entire lifetime. The next case involves a name known around the world, and a son who made an extraordinary decision about his own future. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's deputy Führer, the third most powerful man in the Nazi hierarchy for much of the regime's existence, behind only Hitler and Göring. He is also one of the most peculiar figures of the entire era, best known for his unexplained solo flight to Scotland in May 1941, during which he apparently attempted to negotiate a peace agreement with Britain without Hitler's authorization. He was captured, held as a prisoner of war, tried at Nuremberg, and ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. He served that sentence at Spandau prison in Berlin, and he served almost all of it. He died in August 1987 at the age of 93, having spent 46 years behind bars. His son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was born in 1937, just 4 years before his father flew to Scotland and disappeared from his life. He grew up largely without a father, trained as an architect, and when he was old enough to understand what his father had been and what had happened to him, he dedicated a significant portion of his adult life to one cause: securing Rudolf Hess's release from Spandau. Wolf Rüdiger wrote books arguing that his father had been treated unjustly. He lobbied governments, he gave interviews, he maintained that his father's peace mission should have been treated as evidence of goodwill rather than as the act of a war criminal. His efforts were unsuccessful. The Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, maintained joint authority over Spandau and repeatedly refused appeals for early release, with the Soviet Union consistently blocking any attempt to free Rudolf Hess. What makes Wolf Rüdiger's case particularly complex is that he was advocating not for a man who had personally directed mass murder. Rudolf Hess's role in specific atrocities, while significant, was less direct than Himmler's or Bormann's, but for a father he had barely known, and whose guilt or innocence he seemed genuinely to wrestle with. Wolf Rüdiger Hess passed away in 2001. His father's legacy remains debated among historians, though his conviction at Nuremberg has never been seriously challenged in mainstream scholarship. The story of Rudolf Hess's son is, in many ways, the story of a child reaching toward a father who was always just out of reach, and whose name was synonymous with one of history's most catastrophic regimes. But some of the most extraordinary stories didn't happen in Germany at all. Some happened thousands of miles away, in Argentina. Adolf Eichmann was one of the principal organizers of the deportation of Jewish populations across Europe to concentration and extermination camps. He operated with bureaucratic precision, managing the logistics of transport on a massive scale. He was not a figure who appeared often in public. He worked from offices, issued orders, and kept meticulous records. After the war, he escaped. He fled to Argentina under a false name, Ricardo Clement, and built a quiet life near Buenos Aires. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory. He lived in a modest house. He had a family. His wife and 3 sons, Klaus, Horst, and Dieter, joined him in Argentina. A 4th son, Ricardo, was born there. For years, he was invisible. In May 1960, Israeli intelligence agents located him, seized him from the street near his home in the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando, smuggled him out of the country, and brought him to Israel to stand trial. The Eichmann trial, held in Jerusalem in 1961, was one of the most significant legal proceedings of the post-war era. He was found guilty and executed in 1962. His sons' lives after that point took different paths, and the most publicly known of them, Klaus Eichmann, spoke on record about his father. He expressed in the years following the trial that he found it difficult to accept the portrait of his father presented by the court, and for a time appeared to defend him. He later appeared to moderate those views, though the degree to which he accepted his father's guilt remained a subject of some ambiguity. Dieter Eichmann, another of the sons, gave an interview in 2009 in which he acknowledged that what his father had done was wrong and expressed that he and his brothers lived with the weight of the name they carried. He described having had to come to terms with a history that was not of their choosing. The Eichmann sons lived for decades in Argentina, and their lives illustrate a particular dynamic that appeared repeatedly among the children of Nazi perpetrators, growing up with a father who presented one face to the family and had an entirely different history behind it. What makes the Eichmann case so gripping is that these were children who had known their father, who had lived with him, eaten meals with him, been raised by him, and who then had to watch the world reveal who he actually was. The trial itself was a landmark moment. It was one of the first major war crimes proceedings to be broadcast on television, and it brought testimony from survivors that had never before been heard so widely. For the sons watching from Argentina, it must have been a particular kind of rupture. The private father they knew being dismantled account by account in front of a global audience. There is also a dimension to the Eichmann case that extends beyond his immediate children. His capture set off a chain of consequences across the network of former Nazis who had settled in South America. Others who had been living quietly under assumed identities suddenly became aware that they were not as hidden as they had believed. The operation demonstrated that time and distance were not the same as safety. For the sons, the aftermath of the trial meant growing up in a country, Argentina, that had its own complex relationship with the post-war influx of European émigrés, many of whom had questionable wartime histories. The broader community around them was aware of who they were. Their surname, even in Buenos Aires, carried weight that no amount of ordinary daily life could fully dissolve. Dieter Eichmann's 2009 interview remains one of the more frank acknowledgments by a senior perpetrator's child of what their father had actually done. He did not attempt to minimize the scale of it. He described it as a burden that had shaped the entire course of his life, not just his relationship with his father's memory, but his relationship with his own identity, with Argentina, and with the question of how to live with a name that the world associated with one of the worst administrative crimes in history. The next case involves one of the most famous names in the entire Nazi hierarchy, and what that name meant for the people forced to carry it into the modern world. Hermann Göring was, at various points, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. He founded the Gestapo, commanded the Luftwaffe, and was the highest-ranking Nazi defendant at the Nuremberg trials. He was sentenced to death, but died by taking his own life the night before his scheduled execution in 1946. He had one daughter, Etta Göring, born in 1938. Etta grew up in a Germany that had been rebuilt from ruin, carrying one of the most recognizable and reviled surnames in modern history. She reportedly maintained a defense of her father's image for much of her life, and in interviews given over the years, expressed her belief that he had been a great man. She became something of a legal fighter, in several cases challenging the sale or display of her father's personal effects and artworks. She pursued legal battles over items that had been seized or auctioned, and she appeared in court proceedings related to art looted during the war that had passed through her father's possession. Her efforts to preserve or reclaim her father's legacy drew significant criticism, particularly from historians and from survivors' organizations. But the more complex case within the Göring family, and perhaps one of the strangest decisions made by any descendant of a senior Nazi figure, came from a more distant branch of the family. Hermann Göring's great-niece, Bettina Göring, and her brother made the decision to voluntarily undergo procedures so that they would have no biological children of their own. Bettina eventually left Germany and settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They made this decision explicitly because of the name and the blood they carried, a deliberate choice to end that particular line of the family. This was not a story that received enormous media coverage, but it was documented in interviews and reported by journalists who spoke with the individuals involved. Their reasoning, as they explained it, was straightforward. They did not want to pass on the Göring name or lineage. It is one of the most dramatic responses to inherited guilt in the entire post-war era. and it stands in stark contrast to others who carried the same kind of legacy and chose very different paths. There is one more case that cannot be overlooked, a case involving the children of the man whose name defined the entire regime. Adolf Hitler did not have children of his own, or at least none that have ever been definitively confirmed. But he had a family. He had a half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., and through him, a nephew, William Patrick Hitler, who was born in Liverpool in 1911, to Alois and his Irish wife, Bridget Dowling. William Patrick Hitler's story is extraordinary in its own right. He actually lived in Germany for a time in the 1930s, attempted to leverage his uncle's rise to power for personal benefit, and had a complicated and deteriorating relationship with Adolf Hitler himself. He eventually left Germany, traveled to the United States, and, in one of the more remarkable twists of the century, served in the United States Navy during the Second World War, fighting against the regime his uncle led. After the war, William Patrick Hitler settled on Long Island in New York under the changed surname Stuart Houston. He married and had 4 sons, Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian. Howard died in a car accident in 1989. The remaining brothers are believed to still be living on Long Island in deliberate obscurity. In 2001, a journalist named David Gardner published a book documenting his contact with the family. The brothers, from what was reported, had reached a quiet understanding among themselves. None of them would have children. Like the Göring relatives, they had decided to let their branch of the family end with them. They lived, and likely still live, with no public records, no interviews, and no confirmation of their identities beyond what journalists have pieced together. They carry with them the knowledge of what their great-uncle did, and they have apparently concluded that the best response is silence and an ending. There is a particular weight to this case that is different from all the others. These are not the children of men who signed orders or commanded camps. They are simply people connected by blood to the figure at the center of everything, and they have chosen, without fanfare, to disappear. But disappearing was not always possible. Some children had no choice but to face the world, with everything exposed. Hans Frank was the Governor General of occupied Poland during the Second World War. Under his administration, millions of people, the vast majority of them Jewish, were murdered on Polish soil. He presided over a territory that contained some of the most devastating killing operations of the entire war. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and executed in October 1946. His son, Nicholas Frank, was born in 1939, the youngest of 5 children. He grew up in post-war Germany, eventually became a journalist, and in 1987 published a book about his father. It was not a defense. It was not an attempt at rehabilitation. It was one of the most brutal and unflinching examinations of a Nazi perpetrator ever written by someone who shared his blood. The book, titled in German Der Vater, meaning the father, was a sustained confrontation with Hans Frank's crimes, his personality, and his legacy. Nicholas Frank wrote with open contempt for what his father had done and described his feelings toward him in language that left no ambiguity. He gave interviews for decades. He visited schools. He traveled internationally to speak about his father's crimes and about the need for Germans, and all people, to confront this history directly rather than look away from it. His older brother, Norman Frank, took a more ambivalent position about their father. The 2 brothers, shaped by the same history, came to almost entirely opposite conclusions about how to live with it. And then there is the case of Rudolf Hess's son, a man who grew up inside the grounds of Auschwitz itself. Rudolf Hess was the commandant of Auschwitz, the largest and most lethal extermination camp in history. He oversaw the operation of the camp from 1940 to 1943, during which time over 1 million people were killed within its fences. He was captured after the war, tried in Poland, and executed at Auschwitz itself in April 1947. His family had lived on the grounds of the camp. His wife Hedwig tended a garden. His children played near the perimeter. The Höss family home was located a short distance from the gas chambers. His son, Hans-Jürgen Höss, grew up knowing exactly where he had spent his early childhood and what had happened there. In interviews given later in life, he described having to confront, as an adult, what his childhood home had actually been adjacent to. He described the process as one of the most difficult things a person could face. The realization that normalcy and horror had existed side by side, and that he had been part of the normal half. He appeared in documentaries, spoke at educational events, and became, like Nicholas Frank, a voice for confrontation rather than silence. He expressed that he could not defend his father, and that understanding what his father had done required looking at it directly. The Höss case is particularly striking because of the physical reality of it. This was not a child who grew up across town from his father's crimes. He grew up on the property. The smoke that rose from Auschwitz's crematoria drifted over the garden where his mother grew flowers. That proximity makes his story unlike almost any other among the children of the Nazi leadership. And it raises questions about memory, childhood, and what people are capable of not seeing when they are surrounded by it every day. There is a psychological concept sometimes discussed in connection with these cases, the idea of the normalized extraordinary. Children, more than adults, are capable of accepting their immediate environment as simply the way things are. The garden was the garden. The house was the house. The sounds and the smells and the distant structures were simply part of the landscape of daily life. Understanding what those things actually were came later, sometimes much later, and the process of retrofitting that understanding onto a childhood that had felt ordinary is something Hans-Jürgen Höss described as taking years to even begin. He appeared in the documentary film Inheritance, released in 2006, which brought him together with a Holocaust survivor named Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, who had worked as a forced laborer in the Höss household during the war. Their meeting, two people connected by the most terrible of circumstances, standing together in the same space decades later, is one of the more quietly devastating encounters ever captured on film. Neither of them could fully explain what that meeting meant, but the fact that it happened, that they were both still there to have it, said something that words alone could not. Across these cases, and the many others that have been documented by historians, journalists, and researchers over the decades since 1945, certain patterns began to emerge. Some children, like Gudrun Himmler and Göring, appeared to hold on to their father's legacies with considerable tenacity, defending them in various ways and refusing, in public at least, to fully accept the weight of what had been done. Their lives became, in a sense, extensions of the loyalty they had been raised to feel. Others, like Nicholas Frank, Martin Bormann Jr., Hans-Jürgen Höss, and Dieter Eichmann, moved toward confrontation, some more fully than others, and through very different means. The priest, the journalist, the reluctant interviewee, each found a different way to stand in front of the history they had been handed. And then there were those who simply tried to disappear, who changed their names, left their countries, and asked the world to let them exist without the weight of what their fathers had done. Some of those people succeeded. Some of them are still out there, somewhere, carrying a history they never asked for into a present that does not know their names. The historian Dan Baron spent years interviewing the children of senior Nazi figures and found that the psychological burden carried across this group was profound and consistent. The children of perpetrators faced something that had no clear precedent and no established path forward. They were not guilty of their father's crimes, but they were not free of them either. Baron's research, published in the late 1980s, challenged the assumption that silence was the dominant response among these families. In many cases, the silence had been enforced not by the children, but by the parents, by mothers who deflected questions, by extended family members who discouraged certain conversations, by communities that preferred not to examine what had happened in the houses next door during the war years. The children grew up inside that silence and then had to decide, as adults, what to do about it. What Baron found was that those who had been able to speak openly, even when it was painful, even when it disrupted family relationships, showed signs of having integrated their history more fully than those who continued to avoid it. That integration did not mean peace, exactly. It meant a clearer relationship with a painful truth, which is not the same thing. A researcher named Gerald Posner, who conducted extensive interviews with multiple children of Nazi figures in the 1980s, described a common thread: the difficulty of locating a stable sense of identity when one's name, one's origin, and one's earliest memories were all entangled with one of the worst chapters in recorded history. There is also a generational dimension worth noting. The children of the perpetrators are now, for the most part, elderly or deceased, but they had their own children. And those grandchildren of the Nazi leadership face a different but related set of questions. How do you discuss a grandfather who was executed at Nuremberg? How do you explain a family history that begins in those years to a child who is learning about the Holocaust in school? Several of those grandchildren have spoken publicly about their experiences, and the consensus that emerges is that the weight does not stop at one generation. It carries forward, it changes shape, but it does not simply dissolve. The children of the Nazi leadership did not go one place after 1945. They went everywhere. They became priests and war criminal defenders. They became journalists who spent their lives condemning their fathers and quiet men on Long Island who never spoke about their history at all. They became the subject of documentaries, the focus of historians, and sometimes just neighbors. People at the grocery store or at church whose past no one around them could have guessed. And somewhere, almost certainly, there are still people living today who carry those names, or the remnants of those names, and who wake up every morning knowing exactly what their family history contains. That knowledge does not go away. It does not diminish with time. The children of the men who built and operated the Third Reich have spent 80 years demonstrating, in case after case, that the weight of that history lands somewhere, on someone, long after the men themselves are gone. What each of those people chose to do with that weight is, ultimately, the most human question at the center of this entire story. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.